teacher mocks girl for her military family, but when her grandfather arrives, everyone is shocked. The bell rang, signaling the start of another history class at Westfield High School. Students shuffled into the room, their chatter dying down as they took their seats. Among them was Emily Warren, a quiet 15-year-old with honey blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She made her way to the back of the classroom, sliding into her usual spot by the window. Emily's blue eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar faces of her classmates. Some were still half asleep. Others were hurriedly finishing homework from other classes. As she pulled out her textbook and notebook, her fingers brushed against the small photo tucked into the front pocket of her backpack, a picture of her father in his military uniform, smiling proudly next to her grandfather, Colonel John Warren. The classroom door swung open with a creak, and Mr. Thompson strode in. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses that sat low on his nose. Known for his cynical attitude and penchant for controversial statements, Mr. Thompson was either loved or loathed by his students. There was rarely any middle ground. "All right, settle down," he called out, his voice cutting through the remaining murmurs. "Today, we're continuing our unit on recent conflicts and the role of the military in modern society." Emily perked up at this. While she was usually reserved in class, this was a topic close to her heart. She came from a long line of military service members, and their dedication to their country was a source of immense pride for her. Mr. Thompson began the lesson, his words sharp and often laced with sarcasm. "Now, who can tell me about the impact of these conflicts on families back home?" he asked, his eyes sweeping across the room. Emily hesitated for a moment before slowly raising her hand. Mr. Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. It wasn't often that the quiet girl in the back volunteered information. "Yes, Emily," he acknowledged, a hint of curiosity in his voice. Emily took a deep breath, willing her voice to remain steady. "Well, I can speak from personal experience," she began, her words soft but clear. "My dad is currently serving overseas, and my grandfather was a colonel. It can be really tough on families, but there's also a sense of pride in knowing they're serving our country." For a brief moment, the class was silent. Some students turned in their seats to look at Emily, a few with newfound interest, others with skepticism mirroring Mr. Thompson's expression. The teacher's lips curled into a smirk, and Emily felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She knew that look. It usually preceded one of Mr. Thompson's more controversial statements. "Oh, another military family," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You know, some people would say it's just a job for those who can't find anything else. All that hero talk is a little exaggerated, don't you think?" The words hit Emily like a physical blow. She felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Around her, she could hear a few snickers from her classmates, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Emily opened her mouth to respond, to defend her family and the countless others who served, but no words came out. She felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Mr. Thompson, seemingly oblivious to the impact of his words, continued with the lesson. "Now, let's look at the economic implications of these conflicts," he said, turning to write on the whiteboard. As he spoke, Emily's mind raced. She thought of her father, currently stationed thousands of miles away, missing birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments with his family. She remembered the look of pride in her grandfather's eyes when he spoke of his time in service, the weight of responsibility evident in every word. The rest of the class passed in a blur for Emily. She barely heard Mr. Thompson's lecture, her thoughts consumed by his dismissive words. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the period, Emily was the first one out of her seat, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the classroom. As she walked down the hallway to her next class, Emily could feel the eyes of her classmates on her. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, but most seemed to have already forgotten the incident, moving on to gossip about the upcoming school dance or complain about their homework. Emily, however, couldn't shake off the feeling of humiliation. Her family's military service had always been a source of strength for her, a legacy she was proud to be a part of. Now, for the first time, she felt ashamed to talk about it. The rest of the school day passed in a haze of distraction. In each class, Emily found herself replaying Mr. Thompson's words in her mind, analyzing them from every angle. She tried to focus on her lessons, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the history classroom and the moment that had shaken her confidence. As the final bell rang, Emily walked out of the school building, her steps heavy. The sunny afternoon seemed at odds with her mood, the cheerful chatter of her fellow students grating on her nerves. She began the walk home, her mind still swirling with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to confront Mr. Thompson, to stand up for her family and all the other military families out there. Another part of her wanted to curl up and hide, to never mention her family's service again if it meant avoiding that kind of ridicule. As she turned onto her street, Emily made a decision. She wouldn't tell her mother about what had happened. She had enough to worry about with Dad being deployed. But she needed to talk to someone who would understand. Someone who could help her make sense of her jumbled thoughts and feelings. With a deep breath, Emily pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. After a few rings, a warm, gravelly voice answered. "Hello, sweetheart," her grandfather said, his tone immediately soothing her frayed nerves. "Hi, Grandpa," Emily replied, her voice wavering slightly. "Do you have some time to talk? Something happened at school today, and I could really use your advice." As she began to recount the events of the day, Emily felt a small spark of hope. She didn't know it yet, but her grandfather's response would set in motion a series of events that would change not just her perspective, but that of her entire class. The warm afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the old oak tree in Emily's backyard as she sat on the porch swing, phone pressed to her ear. Her grandfather, Colonel John Warren, listened patiently as she recounted the events of the day, his silence on the other end of the line, both comforting and nerve-wracking. And then, he just dismissed it. Emily finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like everything Dad and you have done, doesn't matter." There was a moment of silence before Colonel Warren spoke, his voice steady and reassuring. "Emily, my dear, I want you to know something. What you're feeling right now, that mix of anger, hurt, and confusion, it's valid. But remember, your teacher's words don't define your family's service or your pride in it." Emily nodded, forgetting for a moment that her grandfather couldn't see her. She wiped away a stray tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I know, Grandpa, it's just, I've never felt ashamed of our family before, and today, in that classroom, I did. I hated it." "Shame is a powerful emotion, sweetheart," Colonel Warren replied, his voice tinged with understanding. "But it's not one you should carry. Your father and I, we serve because we believe in something greater than ourselves. One person's ignorance doesn't change that." As they continued to talk, Emily felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Her grandfather's words were like a balm, soothing the raw edges of her emotions. By the time she hung up the phone, she felt more centered, though a lingering unease remained. The next morning, Emily approached school with a mix of dread and determination. As she walked through the crowded hallways, she couldn't help but feel like everyone was staring at her, whispering about yesterday's incident. In reality, most of her classmates were caught up in their own lives, barely sparing her a glance. Her first few classes passed in a blur of nervous energy. Emily found herself constantly rehearsing what she might say if someone brought up Mr. Thompson's comments, but no one did. The silence was almost worse than confrontation. It made her wonder if anyone had even cared enough to remember. As lunchtime approached, Emily's stomach churned with anxiety. The cafeteria was always a social minefield, but today it felt particularly daunting. She made her way through the lunch line, her eyes darting around the room, searching for a safe place to sit. "Hey, Emily!" a voice called out. She turned to see Sarah, a girl from her English class, waving her over to a table. With a mixture of relief and apprehension, Emily made her way over. As she sat down, Sarah leaned in, her voice low. I heard about what happened in Mr. Thompson's class yesterday. That was really messed up. Are you okay? Emily blinked, surprised by the genuine concern in Sarah's voice. Yeah, I'm okay, she replied, managing a small smile. Thanks for asking. The conversation at the table flowed around her, touching on various topics: the upcoming math test, the latest school gossip, plans for the weekend. Emily found herself relaxing slightly, grateful for the normalcy of it all. However, as she was finishing her lunch, she overheard a snippet of conversation from a nearby table. Did you hear what Mr. Thompson said to that military girl? One boy was saying, his voice tinged with amusement. Man, he really put her in her place. Emily felt her chest tighten, the food in her mouth suddenly tasting like ash. She wanted to stand up, to confront them, to defend her family and all the others who served, but the words stuck in her throat, held back by a mixture of fear and uncertainty. Sarah, noticing Emily's distress, spoke up. Hey, that's not cool, she called out to the other table. You don't know anything about Emily's family or what they've sacrificed. The boy looked taken aback, muttering a half-hearted apology before turning back to his friends. Emily shot Sarah a grateful look, feeling a small spark of warmth in her chest. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. As the day progressed, Emily found herself hyper-aware of every interaction, every glance in her direction. Some of her classmates offered small smiles or words of support, while others seemed to go out of their way to avoid her gaze. The range of reactions was dizzying, leaving Emily feeling both supported and isolated at the same time. By the time history class rolled around, Emily's nerves were frayed. She took her usual seat at the back of the room, her heart pounding as Mr. Thompson entered. She half expected him to make another comment, to double down on his dismissive attitude. But he barely acknowledged her, launching into the day's lesson without so much as a glance in her direction. As Mr. Thompson droned on about economic policies and political maneuvering, Emily found her mind wandering. She thought about her father, wondering what he was doing at that very moment. Was he in danger? Was he thinking of home? The distance between them seemed to stretch even further in that moment, the weight of his absence pressing down on her. When the final bell rang, Emily gathered her things slowly, lost in thought. As she was about to leave the classroom, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she found herself face to face with Jake, one of the more popular boys in her grade. Hey, Emily, he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. I just wanted to say, my cousin's in the army. What Mr. Thompson said yesterday, it wasn't right. Your family's service matters. Emily felt a lump form in her throat, touched by the unexpected support. Thanks, Jake, she managed to say, offering him a small smile. As she walked home that afternoon, Emily's emotions were a jumble. The day had been a roller coaster of support and indifference, understanding and ignorance. She felt drained, yet there was a small spark of hope burning in her chest. Not everyone had dismissed her family's service. Not everyone had laughed along with Mr. Thompson's cruel joke. Stepping into her house, Emily was greeted by the familiar scent of her mother's cooking. The normalcy of it all, the sound of the TV in the background, the pile of mail on the side table, felt both comforting and strange after the tumultuous day. How was school, honey? Her mother called from the kitchen. Emily hesitated for a moment, considering whether to share the events of the past 2 days. But looking at her mother's tired but smiling face, she couldn't bring herself to add to her worries. It was fine, Mom, she replied, forcing a smile. Just a normal day. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Emily's phone buzzed with a text. It was from her grandfather. Thinking of you, sweetheart. Remember, true strength isn't in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. You've got this. Reading his words, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She may have stumbled, may have felt shame and doubt, but she wouldn't let it define her. Her family's legacy was one of resilience, of standing tall in the face of adversity. It was time she lived up to that legacy. With a deep breath, Emily sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. She had an idea. a way to educate her classmates, to make them understand what military service really meant. As she began to type, a plan taking shape on the screen before her, Emily felt a sense of excitement building. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would take control of the narrative. Little did she know, her grandfather had plans of his own, plans that would change everything. The early morning sun had barely begun to paint the sky with hues of pink and gold when Emily's alarm clock jolted her awake. For a moment, she lay in bed, disoriented, the events of the past 2 days flooding back into her consciousness. But as she rubbed the sleep from her eyes, and how did he know about her presentation idea? She quickly typed out a response, asking for clarification, but received no immediate reply. With a mix of curiosity and nervousness churning in her stomach, she began to get ready for school. As she made her way downstairs, Emily could hear her mother on the phone in the kitchen, her voice hushed but excited. "Yes, John, I think it's a wonderful idea. Emily will be so surprised. Oh, she's coming. I've got to go. Good luck today." Emily entered the kitchen just as her mother was hanging up the phone. "Morning, Mom," she said, eyeing her suspiciously. "Who was that on the phone?" Her mother smiled brightly, perhaps a bit too brightly. "Oh, just your grandfather checking in. You know how he worries. Now, eat up. You don't want to be late for school?" The air was thick with unspoken words as Emily ate her breakfast, her mother humming tunelessly as she bustled around the kitchen. Emily knew her mother was hiding something, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it might be. As she walked to school, Emily's mind raced with possibilities. What had her grandfather planned? And why all the secrecy? The unanswered questions only added to the nervous energy that had been building since Mr. Thompson's dismissive comments 2 days ago. As Emily approached Westfield High, she noticed an unusual buzz of activity around the main entrance. Students were huddled in small groups, whispering excitedly and pointing at something near the parking lot. Curiosity piqued. Emily craned her neck to see what was causing such a stir. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw it. A sleek black car with government plates, parked in the spot usually reserved for guest speakers. A small American flag fluttered on the car's antenna, catching the morning sunlight. Emily's mind raced. Could it be? Before she could complete the thought, Sarah from her English class rushed up to her, eyes wide with excitement. "Emily, did you hear? We're getting a special guest speaker today in history class. Everyone's saying it's some big-shot military officer." Emily felt a mix of emotions wash over her, surprise, excitement, and a touch of apprehension. This had to be her grandfather's doing, but how had he managed to arrange this so quickly? As she made her way through the crowded hallways, Emily could hear snippets of conversation all around her. "I heard he's a war hero. Do you think he'll show us his medals? What if he tells us about top-secret missions?" The anticipation in the air was palpable, a stark contrast to the dismissive atmosphere that had permeated Mr. Thompson's classroom just 2 days ago. Emily couldn't help but feel a small surge of pride. Whatever her grandfather had planned, it was already changing the way her classmates viewed the military. When Emily entered her first period class, she was immediately surrounded by curious classmates. "Emily, is it true? Is the guest speaker your grandfather?" Jake asked, his eyes alight with interest. Emily hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I'm not sure," she said honestly. "My grandfather did mention he had made some arrangements, but he didn't give me any details." The morning classes seemed to drag on endlessly, each minute ticking by at an agonizingly slow pace. Emily found it nearly impossible to concentrate on her lessons, her mind constantly wandering to what might unfold in history class. As lunchtime approached, the excitement in the school had reached a fever pitch. The cafeteria was abuzz with speculation about the mysterious guest speaker. Emily overheard wild theories ranging from a covert ops specialist to a fighter pilot who had single-handedly won crucial battles. Amidst all the excitement, Emily noticed Mr. Thompson sitting alone in the teacher's lounge, visible through the cafeteria windows. He seemed subdued, a far cry from his usual confident demeanor. For a moment, Emily felt a twinge of sympathy. Whatever was about to happen in his classroom, Mr. Thompson was clearly unprepared for it. When the bell finally rang, signaling the start of history class, Emily's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone around her could hear it. She took her usual seat at the back of the room, watching as her classmates filed in, their faces a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. Mr. Thompson entered the room last, his usual swagger noticeably absent. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he addressed the class. "As you may have heard, we have a guest speaker joining us today," he began, his voice lacking its usual sarcastic edge. "I expect you all to be on your best behavior and show our visitor the utmost respect." Emily couldn't help but notice the irony in Mr. Thompson's words, given his dismissive comments about the military just 2 days ago. She wondered if he remembered what he had said, if he felt any remorse for his hurtful remarks. The classroom fell into an expectant hush as Mr. Thompson moved to open the door. Emily held her breath, her eyes fixed on the entrance. And then, with a presence that seemed to fill the entire room, Colonel John Warren stepped into the classroom. Emily's grandfather cut an impressive figure in his full dress uniform, his chest adorned with rows of colorful ribbons and medals. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his posture was ramrod straight, exuding an aura of quiet authority. The room fell completely silent, all eyes fixed on the distinguished officer before them. Colonel Warren's eyes scanned the room, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he spotted Emily. She felt a rush of emotions, pride, love, and a touch of nervousness about what was to come. Mr. Thompson, looking somewhat flustered, stepped forward to introduce their guest. "Class, we are honored to have with us today Colonel John Warren, a decorated veteran with over 30 years of service. Colonel Warren has graciously agreed to speak to us about his experiences in the military and the importance of service to our country." As Mr. Thompson stepped back, Colonel Warren moved to the front of the classroom. His voice, when he spoke, was strong and clear, carrying easily to every corner of the room. "Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here today, not just as a veteran, but as a father and a grandfather. I'm here to share with you what it truly means to serve, not just for those of us in uniform, but for the families who support us and the country we all call home." Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she watched her classmates lean forward in their seats, captivated by her grandfather's presence. She knew that whatever came next would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone in that classroom. As Colonel Warren began his presentation, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. This was more than just a guest speaker visit. It was a chance to set the record straight, to show her classmates and Mr. Thompson the true meaning of service and sacrifice. And as she watched her grandfather command the attention of the entire room, Emily knew that this was a moment she would remember for the rest of her life. The classroom was silent as Colonel John Warren stood before them, his presence commanding respect, without a single word spoken. Emily watched as her classmates sat up straighter, their eyes fixed on her grandfather with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Even Mr. Thompson, who had been so dismissive just days ago, seemed to shrink in his chair at the back of the room. Colonel Warren's eyes swept across the classroom, his gaze lingering for a moment on Emily before addressing the entire class. "When I was asked to speak to you today," he began, his voice steady and resonant, "I thought long and hard about what I wanted to say. I could tell you about the medals on my chest, or the battles I've fought, but that's not why I'm here." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The students exchanged glances, clearly intrigued by this unexpected opening. "I'm here to tell you about people," Colonel Warren continued. "The men and women I've had the honor to serve alongside, the families who wait anxiously at home, the communities that support us, because that's what military service is really about, people." As he spoke, Colonel Warren moved away from the teacher's desk, standing in the center of the room. His movements were deliberate, his posture impeccable, a testament to years of discipline and training. "Let me tell you about Private James Rodriguez," he said, his voice taking on a softer tone. "Fresh out of high school, barely older than many of you. On his first deployment, our unit came under heavy fire. James didn't hesitate. He ran through a hail of bullets to drag 2 of his wounded comrades to safety. He didn't do it for glory or recognition. He did it because those men were his brothers, and that's what family does. Emily could see the impact of her grandfather's words on her classmates. Jake, who had been so supportive the day before, was leaning forward, completely engrossed. Sarah, usually quick with a witty comment, was silent, her eyes wide with emotion. Colonel Warren continued, his voice gaining strength. Or let me tell you about Lieutenant Sarah Chen, brilliant engineer, could have had her pick of cushy corporate jobs. Instead, she chose to serve, spent months in grueling conditions, building infrastructure in war-torn regions, schools, hospitals, bridges, giving communities the tools to rebuild their lives. That's service. As he spoke, Colonel Warren's eyes occasionally met Emily's. In those moments, she could see the pride and love shining in his gaze, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was her heritage, her family's legacy of service and sacrifice. But it's not just about those in uniform, Colonel Warren said, his voice softening again. It's about the families left behind, the spouses who become both mother and father while their partners are deployed, the children who brave school plays and baseball games with an empty seat in the audience, praying for their parents' safe return. At this, Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She thought of her own father, currently deployed thousands of miles away. She thought of her mother, staying strong for both of them, never letting on how much she worried. For the first time, Emily truly understood the depth of their sacrifice. Colonel Warren paused, allowing his words to settle over the classroom. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional sniffle, as some students struggled to contain their emotions. Service isn't about glory or adventure, he continued, his voice firm but compassionate. It's about commitment. It's about believing in something greater than yourself and being willing to sacrifice for it. It's about standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. As he spoke, Colonel Warren's eyes found Mr. Thompson, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable at the back of the room. There was no accusation in the colonel's gaze, only a calm certainty that seemed to challenge the teacher's previous dismissive attitude. Now, I'm not here to recruit you, Colonel Warren said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Military service isn't for everyone, and that's okay. What I hope you'll take away from this is an understanding of what service truly means, whether it's in the armed forces, in your community, or in your daily lives. He turned, gesturing to the window where the American flag fluttered in the breeze outside. That flag represents more than just a country. It represents an idea that all people are created equal, that we have inalienable rights, and that we stand together in the face of adversity. When we serve, in whatever capacity, we're upholding those ideals. Emily felt a surge of pride as she watched her classmates nod in agreement, some wiping away tears. She saw a new respect in their eyes, not just for her grandfather, but for all those who served. Colonel Warren's voice softened as he continued, I've lost friends in service. I've seen the toll it takes on families. But I've also seen incredible acts of bravery, kindness, and selflessness. I've seen communities come together to support their service members. I've seen the joy of homecomings and the strength of those who persevere through hardship. He paused, his eyes once again finding Emily's. And I've seen the next generation, young people like yourselves, stepping up to make a difference. Whether it's through military service, community involvement, or simply being there for one another, you all have the power to serve, to make a positive impact on the world around you. As Colonel Warren's introduction drew to a close, the atmosphere in the classroom had transformed. The initial awe had given way to a deep, respectful silence. Emily could see the impact of her grandfather's words reflected in the faces of her classmates. Some were misty-eyed. Others wore expressions of newfound understanding and respect. Mr. Thompson, still seated at the back of the room, seemed to have shrunk into himself. The contrast between his dismissive comments from days ago and the powerful testimony they had just heard was stark, and Emily could see the realization dawning on his face. Colonel Warren's voice, when he spoke again, was gentle but firm. "I'm here today not to lecture, but to share, to help you understand the reality of service and sacrifice. And I'm here to listen, to answer your questions, and to hear your thoughts, because understanding goes both ways, and your perspective is just as valuable as mine." As her grandfather opened the floor for questions, Emily felt a surge of gratitude and pride. This was more than just a lesson in history or civics. It was a lesson in humanity, in the power of service, and in the strength that comes from standing together. And as she watched her classmates eagerly raise their hands, ready to engage and learn, Emily knew that this day would mark a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone in that classroom. As Colonel Warren opened the floor for questions, there was a moment of hesitation. The impact of his words had left the class in a reflective silence, each student processing the powerful introduction they had just heard. Then, slowly, hands began to rise. Jake, the boy who had shown Emily support the day before, was the first to speak up. "Sir," he began, his voice filled with a newfound respect, "you mentioned the families left behind. Can you tell us more about what it's like for them?" Colonel Warren nodded, his eyes softening as he considered the question. "That's an excellent question, Jake. The families of service members are the unsung heroes of our military." He paused, his gaze drifting to Emily for a moment, before continuing. "Imagine celebrating your child's birthday over a grainy video call, thousands of miles apart, or holding your breath every time the phone rings, hoping it's not bad news. The families carry a weight that's often invisible to the outside world." As he spoke, Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She thought of her mother, always putting on a brave face, and of the countless milestones her father had missed. For the first time, she saw her own experience reflected in the understanding faces of her classmates. Sarah, usually the class comedian, raised her hand next. Her voice was uncharacteristically serious as she asked, "How do you deal with the fear? I mean, knowing you might not come home?" Colonel Warren's expression grew solemn. "Fear is a constant companion in war, Sarah. Anyone who tells you they're never afraid is either lying or foolish. The key is not to let fear paralyze you." He took a deep breath before continuing, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I remember a night in Afghanistan. We were pinned down, outnumbered. I was terrified. But then I looked at the young soldiers under my command, saw the trust in their eyes. In that moment, my fear of letting them down was greater than my fear of dying. That's what gets you through, the knowledge that others are counting on you." The class was silent, hanging on every word. Emily could see the impact of her grandfather's story in the wide eyes and solemn faces of her peers. Even Mr. Thompson, still seated at the back of the room, seemed to be listening intently, his earlier dismissive attitude nowhere to be seen. Another student, Michael, who Emily knew had been considering joining the military after graduation, raised his hand. "Sir, what would you say to someone who's thinking about enlisting? What should they know that maybe isn't in the recruitment brochures?" Colonel Warren smiled, a mix of pride and caution in his expression. "That's a big question, Michael. The first thing I'd say is that it's not a decision to be made lightly. Military service can be incredibly rewarding, but it also demands sacrifices, from you and from your loved ones." He paused, considering his words carefully. "The recruitment posters show you the glory, the adventure, and those things exist, but they don't show you the long nights of homesickness, the grueling physical and mental challenges, the weight of responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform." Colonel Warren's gaze swept across the room, making eye contact with each student. "But they also don't show you the unbreakable bonds you'll form, the sense of purpose you'll find, or the pride you'll feel in serving something greater than yourself. It's a calling, not just a job. And if it's your calling, there's no greater honor." As he finished speaking, Emily noticed several of her classmates nodding thoughtfully. She realized that her grandfather's words were giving them a perspective they had never considered before, challenging their preconceptions about military service. Lily, a quiet girl who rarely spoke up in class, hesitantly raised her hand. "Colonel Warren," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, How do you cope with losing people you serve with? Does it ever get easier? The room fell silent, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Colonel Warren's expression softened, a flicker of old pain crossing his features. Lily, that's one of the hardest parts of service. And I wish I could tell you it gets. Colonel Warren's expression softened, a flicker of old pain crossing his features. Lily, that's one of the hardest parts of service. And I wish I could tell you it gets easier. But the truth is, it doesn't. Each loss hits just as hard as the first. He paused, his gaze distant as if looking back through the years. I remember every face, every name, Staff Sergeant Maria Alvarez, who could make us laugh even in the darkest moments. Lieutenant Tom Baker, who always volunteered for the toughest missions to spare his men. Private First Class Kevin Chen, barely out of high school, who died saving a local child from a landmine. The classroom was utterly silent, the air heavy with emotion. Emily could see tears in the eyes of several of her classmates. Even Mr. Thompson, still seated at the back of the room, seemed deeply moved, his earlier cynicism replaced by a look of profound respect. Colonel Warren continued, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. You don't get over these losses. You carry them with you, but you also carry their memory, their bravery, their sacrifice. You honor them by continuing the mission, by living up to the example they set. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each student. And you find strength in the ones still with you, in the camaraderie that only comes from facing adversity together. It's a bond that's hard to explain to those who haven't experienced it. Emily felt a swell of emotion in her chest. She had always known her grandfather as a strong, stoic figure. Seeing him open up about the pain and loss he had experienced gave her a new appreciation for the depth of his service and sacrifice. Another student, David, raised his hand. Sir, you mentioned that service isn't just about the military. Can you tell us more about that? How can we serve if we don't join the armed forces? Colonel Warren's face brightened at the question. That's an excellent point, David. Service comes in many forms, and they're all vital to our society. He began to pace slowly at the front of the room, his voice passionate. Think about the teachers who dedicate their lives to educating the next generation, the first responders who rush into danger to save others, the volunteers who give their time to help those in need, the civic leaders who work tirelessly to improve their communities. As he spoke, Emily noticed her classmates sitting up straighter, their eyes shining with interest and understanding. Service is about putting others before yourself, Colonel Warren continued. It's about using your skills and talents to make a positive difference in the world around you. That could mean joining a local volunteer organization, mentoring a younger student, or even just being there for a friend in need. He paused, looking around the room with a warm smile. Each of you has the power to serve, to make a difference. It doesn't require a uniform or a battlefield. It requires compassion, dedication, and a willingness to step up when others need you. The impact of his words was visible on the faces of the students. Emily could see a new light in their eyes, a spark of inspiration and understanding. She realized that her grandfather wasn't just changing their perception of the military. He was broadening their understanding of what it means to contribute to society. Samantha, a student known for her involvement in various school clubs, raised her hand next. Colonel Warren,